I went back to check, and it was 2 years ago that I began an Advent sermon with a quote from Episcopal priest Fleming Rutledge. Since that occurred way back when I was still in my 30s, and since today's the first Sunday of Advent, I thought we might as well hear that quote again. Rutledge once wrote, "Advent begins in the dark." Those 5 words are so poignant because they are literally and metaphorically true. Literally, these early Advent days are the darkest of the year. The sun seems to disappear sooner and return later. And it's no accident that long, long ago the church chose to celebrate Christmas on December 25th, because this is the day when ancient people noticed that light was slowly beginning to grow again. But right now, December 25th feels a long way off. And if we're honest, the world feels pretty dark too. Which brings us to the metaphorical truth of Rutledge's words. Darkness in ancient times meant confusion and chaos. Because once the sun went down, you really didn't know what was out there. Back then, when it got dark, it was just dark. No phone flashlight, no porch light, no Alexa, turn on living room. So darkness was synonymous with uncertainty and fear and confusion and chaos. And let's face it, that's a pretty good description of how things feel these days. With all of our alternative facts and the predatory scams going on and fake news and government cover-ups and AI-generated videos, how is anyone supposed to know what to believe anymore? You can't trust what you see or hear or read. You're always wondering, what's the angle? What's the catch? Am I being tricked here? We find ourselves in the dark. How beautiful then that our first reading this morning takes us back to the very beginning of the Bible, to the time before there was any light at all. Genesis tells us that in this eternal moment, before there was anything, there was God. And in verse 3 of that first reading, it says that God's Spirit hovered over the primordial chaos. It seems to me that the very first thing our Bibles are trying to tell us is that darkness and chaos are where God will show up. But it's hard to trust that. When life is this uncertain, our human instinct is to retreat and reinforce. We look for voices that sound like us. We search out podcasts or YouTube channels or news sources that confirm what we already thought. We build our echo chambers and stay in the places where no one can challenge us, and we call that our research. And of course, all of this only makes things worse. We grow more divided, more certain that we are right and they're wrong, because conveniently, there are 3 clips that may have been edited or taken out of context or AI generated, but what's the big deal? Because these clips agree with my long-held correct beliefs. You see, in the end, we don't just shut others out, we shut God out too. Our echo chambers become little worlds where we trust only our ideas. And that is always where the darkness deepens. If only there was a way for truth with a capital T to break in. If only there was a word that didn't depend on algorithms or our own certainty. How is anything supposed to overcome all this confusion and chaos and darkness? You see, friends, this is where Advent begins. It begins with people like us, longing for the truth to break in again. It begins with people waiting for a holy word to speak life again. It begins with people watching for the God who hovers over chaos. And John's gospel prologue that we heard announces to us exactly this. Our gospel reading, John chapter 1, is really just Genesis chapter 1 remixed a little bit. John tells us that the Word, the same creative power that once called light out of darkness, this Word now steps into our confusion as a human being. Our chaos, our lies, our echo chambers, our fear, our self-deception, all of it is being brought into direct contact with God's love and light. The Word becomes flesh because God knows that we need someone to enter the chaos with us. When life is confusing, we don't need to be shamed for not having it all together, and we don't need to be flattered for already being right. We need someone to walk into the mess with us, to sit in the chaos and stay beside us there. I've learned this the hard way as a parent. If you've ever tried to help a tired 10-year-old with long division, you know exactly how small your wisdom can feel. I used to think that when one of my kids was overwhelmed, I could logic them back into calm. Let me tell you, that never worked. But thanks to the wisdom and the persistence of my incredible wife, I'm slowly learning that when kids are in these moments of overwhelm, what they need is for someone just to join them there. Not with explanations or cold, hard facts, but with simple compassion. About a year ago, my son had put off a lot of homework until the last minute. I have no idea where he gets this behavior from. And so I was helping him with his math, and he was overwhelmed and not very nice. And I was tired and tempted to get frustrated, but for once, maybe only once, I paused long enough to imagine what he was feeling. Hey, I said, I know this feels like a lot, but let's just do 5 problems, and then we'll take a snack break before we tackle the rest of your homework. I have no idea how my son solved those 5 problems, not because he was upset, but because this new math that they do looks suspiciously like IKEA directions. There were lots of steps, and none of it resembled what I was taught learning growing up, but he finished his work quickly, and he got the right answers, and so I didn't ask a lot of questions. I just stared at him in awe and poured us both bowls of Cinnamon Toast Crunch. And for a few minutes, we just sat there in silence, eating our cereal. But then I asked him, because I was curious, and I said, what are you thinking about right now? And my son paused for a second, and then he said, I was just thinking that when I'm a dad, I'll remember this as the perfect moment of a dad and a son. I'm not sharing this story so you'll think I'm a perfect father, because I'm not. But I share this to show us all how powerful it is when someone steps into your chaos. Not to fix it, but just to be with you. That kind of presence has a way of carrying us. And as I've been saying, Advent begins in the dark. And this is exactly where God chooses to meet us. Because God refuses to leave us alone in the darkness that oftentimes we ourselves have made. These 4 weeks invite us to imagine how significant Jesus' birth really is. To imagine what it might mean for Jesus to step into our chaos. What would happen if you trusted Jesus with the most fragile parts of yourself? What would happen if you brought the darkest corners of your life into Christ's light and then discovered that Jesus can hold even that? This is exactly what the gospel says Jesus does for us. He enters our sin and our sorrow and our death and refuses to let them have the last word. When you have really been met there, when you experience Jesus as the light that shines in your darkness, it does something to you. All I did for my son was sit with him in his frustration and give him some cereal. But he's going to remember that. And one day he's going to try to offer the same kind of steady presence to his own kids. That's the pattern of the gospel. The way Christ loves us becomes the way we begin to love others. His light becomes our light. His compassion becomes our compassion. Jesus is the light in our darkness so that we can become light for others. This is where Advent is leading us. In a world obsessed with who's right and what's true and can I trust this source, God gives us something even more powerful than answers. God gives us compassion and companionship. God gives us God's self. And then God gives us to one another. So this week, instead of worrying about being right, let's ask, whose darkness can I walk into? Whose chaos can I sit beside? Where can my presence help someone know that they're not alone in all of this? This church is the beginning of everything. Christ has come into your darkness so that you can go into someone else's with that same love and that same light.